The storm outside was battering the floor-to-ceiling glass, a chaotic symphony of wind and rain that usually made me feel like a captain steering a ship through a hurricane. But inside my apartment, the silence was heavy, almost physical. I stopped dead in the entryway, water dripping from my trench coat onto the hardwood. There, curled onto my vintage velvet sofa like a stray cat seeking heat, was Valentina. The culinary world's sharpest blade, the woman currently holding our Michelin stars together with sheer willpower and terrifying standards, was asleep in my sanctuary. She was supposed to be reviewing the autumn menu. Instead, she had collapsed in the one room I kept locked against the world. Seeing her there, defenses stripped away, hit me with a jolt of something that felt dangerously like possessiveness. To understand the sheer anomaly of this image, you have to understand Valentina. In the professional kitchen, she is not a person. She is a kinetic event. She processes flavors, temperatures, and timings at a velocity that makes normal conversation feel like slow motion. She is the Ferrari of the culinary world, a high-performance engine designed for speed, precision, and overwhelming power. But Ferraris aren't built for traffic. They aren't built for the mundane, grinding, stop-and-go of restaurant administration. They are built to run at the red line until the fuel cuts out. I am the executive sous chef. I am the structure. I build the roads, the guardrails, the safety checks. She flies, and I ensure she doesn't burn up on re-entry. But looking at her now, one arm thrown carelessly over her eyes to block the dim amber light, I saw the cost of that speed. She runs so hot, scanning every micro-expression and imbalance, that she's essentially a Ferrari engine equipped with bicycle brakes. When she tries to stop, the pads burn out. She crashes. And apparently, she had decided that my living room was the only safe place to wreck. My apartment is a study in controlled sensory input. Low amber lighting from vintage lamps, never the harsh overhead fluorescents that make Valentina squint and fidget during menu development meetings. The walls are soundproof to a level usually reserved for recording studios. No ticking clocks, just the hum of the city far below, and the scent of old paper and leather. It's a vacuum, a void. For me, it's a place to think. For her, I realized, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, it must be the only place where the internal static finally quiets down. The noise in her head, that constant buzzing hive of variables and outcomes, couldn't follow her in here. The environment I curated for my own peace had inadvertently become the only off switch for her overactive neurology. I walked closer, my boots silent on the rug. She looked younger like this. The sharp lines of her jaw, usually set in determination, were soft. Her hair, typically pulled back in a severe, don't-touch-me chignon, was spilling loose over the cushions. It felt intrusive to look at her this unguarded, like reading a diary she'd left open. But I couldn't look away. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to cover her, to stand between her and the door, to guard this rare moment of stillness. In the kitchen, the sensory violence is absolute. The shouting of orders, the searing hiss of scallops hitting the plancha, the clatter of stainless steel against granite. Valentina absorbs it all. She stands in the center of the storm, conducting the chaos, her temperature rising with the ambient heat of the ovens. She thrives on the friction. But the crash is the price she pays for the brilliance. I've seen her hands shake after a double shift, a subtle tremor she hides in her pockets. I've seen the way her eyes glaze over when the adrenaline finally dumps, leaving her hollowed out and gray. Usually, she retreats to her own sleek, cold apartment to recover. But tonight, the storm had driven her here, to the warmth, to the structure I provide. She had sought out the one person who knew how to handle the machinery without breaking it. That afternoon on the sofa should have been a singular glitch in the matrix, an anomaly filed away under extreme exhaustion and never spoken of again. But the autumn menu launch was a relentless beast, a hydra that grew 2 new heads for every supply chain issue we severed. As the development phase dragged into its 3rd week, the boundaries between my apartment and her necessity began to erode. It started with small, desperate incursions. She would drift in at 2 p.m., ostensibly to review the costing on the truffle dish, but her eyes would be glazed, her movements vibrating with a frequency that set my own teeth on edge. She wouldn't sit at the dining table with her spreadsheets. She would gravitate toward the sofa, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees until the screen eventually went dark and her head tipped back against the velvet. It wasn't laziness. I knew that. It was a biological mandate for regulation. One evening, when the silence between us felt particularly heavy with unasked questions, she gave it a name. Body doubling, she murmured, not looking up from the notebook she was shredding with a red pen. She explained that her brain, left to its own devices in a silent room, would cannibalize itself. Absolute silence wasn't peaceful for her. It was a vacuum that her mind frantically tried to fill with noise, anxiety, and catastrophic projections about the Michelin Guide. I can't turn it off when I'm alone, she admitted, the confession stripping away another layer of her armor. But when you're here, when I can hear you turning pages, or sketching plating diagrams, or just breathing, my brain knows it doesn't have to be on guard. You're the designated driver for the reality check. I can let go. I became her anchor. It was a strange, heady promotion from executive sous chef to human tether. I found myself curating the environment not just for my own focus, but for her decompression. I switched to working with a fountain pen because the rhythmic, scratchy sound of the nib against paper seemed to act as a lullaby for her over-revved nervous system. There was an intimacy to this routine that felt far more dangerous than a dinner date. This was the backstage reality. This was me witnessing the precise moment the tension left her shoulders, watching the Iron Chef dissolve into a woman who needed someone else's presence just to feel safe enough to close her eyes. I would sit in my armchair, ostensibly reviewing invoices, but my attention was split. Half of me was analyzing food costs, the other half was hyper-aware of the woman 10 feet away. I tracked her breathing. I noted the way her hand curled under her cheek, seeking the texture of the fabric. My apartment began to change under this regime. It was no longer just my sanctuary. It was becoming a shared atmosphere. The air, usually crisp and neutral, began to carry the weight of her presence, even when she wasn't there. Her perfume, a complex, neurotic blend of saffron, cold metal, and expensive jasmine, started to layer over the scent of my books. It was a territorial marker, invisible and undeniable. I became complicit in the secret rituals. The kitchen staff believed I was outsourcing rare ingredients. In reality, I was sitting in a dim room, turning pages quietly, providing the white noise of existence so Valentina could sleep without dreaming of failure. We were alone in the tower, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the gravity building between us. The board of directors and the Michelin inspectors believe Valentina is made of marble. They see the woman who stands at the pass, spine-fused steel, hands folded on the stainless counter like a resting saint while the kitchen burns around her. They don't see the cost of that stillness. They don't see the static. But in the late hours, when the heavy oak door of my apartment clicked shut and the tumblers locked the world out, I became the sole witness to the electricity she spent all day grounding. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, thick with a proximity that felt less like colleagues working late and more like a prelude to something inevitable. It started with a tasting spoon, a vintage silver instrument she spun through her fingers, a blur of motion so fast it made the air hum. Then there was the leg bounce, a rapid, seismic rhythm that shook the cushions of the sofa. In a meeting, she would lock that energy down under the table. Here, she let the tremor run free. It wasn't nervousness. It was the engine idling, the overflow of a mind processing data at a rate that would burn out a lesser machine. But the quirk that tested my own composure was the way she chewed on her lower lip when the data didn't align. She would worry the soft skin with her teeth, biting down with a savage intensity that betrayed the polished veneer of the Iron Chef. Watching her do it felt like seeing a crack in a diamond. It was a glimpse of the friction happening inside her head, the sheer grinding effort of thinking 10 steps ahead of everyone else. I found myself staring at her mouth, fascinated by the contrast between the violence of the habit and the softness of her face. It wasn't annoying. It was intimately revealing, seeing the wiring under the dashboard, the sparks flying where the connections were loose. Sometimes the energy was too high for the sofa. Those were the nights she paced. She would kick off her heels, leaving them abandoned by the door like shipwrecked vessels, and walk the perimeter of the room. I would swivel my chair, tracking her movement in the low light. She moved with a predator's fluidity, a restless, prowling rhythm that seemed to sync with the beating of my own heart. Back and forth, window to bookshelf to door. The soft swish of her silk blouse, the muffled thud of her stocking feet on the carpet. It was a sensory loop that I drank in. There was a sultry, charged quality to it, watching a woman so powerful unravel in my space. The air between us thickened, heavy with her static and my silent, unflinching observation. I wasn't just working anymore. I was keeping time with her chaos. The truce with the static couldn't last forever. The autumn menu launch was looming like a storm front on the horizon, a low-pressure system that sucked the air out of the room days before it even arrived. Michelin had sent the signal, the subtle, terrifying nod that they were reevaluating our third star. In this industry, you don't own your stars. You rent them, and the rent is paid in blood, sweat, and a level of perfection that borders on pathology. The kitchen, usually a place of rhythmic, focused violence, transformed into a pressure cooker where the lid was rattling dangerously against the pot. For Valentina, this was the trigger event. The sensory input of the kitchen, which she usually surfed like a wave, began to crash down on her head. I watched the deterioration happen in real time. It wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of her filters. The noise was the first thing to breach the walls. The kitchen is a cacophony. The roar of the extraction fans, the metallic crash of pans hitting the wash station, the shout of "order in" and "yes, chef," overlapping into a wall of sound. For a neurotypical brain, this is background noise. For Valentina, whose mind possesses no editorial function, every single sound was a distinct, high-priority alert screaming for attention. I saw the static building behind her eyes during prep. We were working on the venison dish, a complex architecture of game, elderberry, and smoke. It required absolute precision. Usually, Valentina moves with a terrifying economy of motion, her hands knowing exactly where the salt is, where the heat is. But today, she was vibrating. Her hand hovered over the mise en place, tweezers trembling slightly as she reached for a nasturtium leaf. She pulled back, reached again, pulled back. It was the paralysis of choice. To anyone else, it looked like hesitation. To me, it looked like a system error. Her brain was calculating the trajectory of the leaf, the wilting point under the heat lamps, the aesthetic balance of the green against the dark sauce, and the potential critique of a cryptic inspector, all simultaneously. The data stream was too heavy. The processor was freezing. I tried to step in. I tried to be the regulator in the wild, not just in the sanctuary. I moved to her station, sliding into the space beside her with the familiarity of a dance partner. "Chef," I said, pitching my voice low, trying to find that resonant frequency that cut through the panic in my apartment. "The sauce is reduced. Service in 10. I was trying to be the guardrail. I was trying to narrow her world down to the next 10 minutes, to block out the catastrophic what-ifs and force her to focus on the what is. But the kitchen isn't the apartment. There were no velvet cushions here to absorb the shock, no amber light to soften the edges of reality. The harsh fluorescent lights bounced off the stainless steel, creating a glare that made her squint and flinch. My voice, usually her anchor, was drowned out by a line cook dropping a stack of sizzle platters. The crash echoed like a gunshot. Valentina jumped, her hand jerking, sending the tweezers clattering across the pass. She didn't pick them up. She stared at them, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was spiraling. The perfectionism that drove her genius was now eating her alive. She wasn't cooking anymore. She was drowning in variables. She looked at the sauce pot bubbling on the induction burner, a simple reduction she could make in her sleep, and looked at me with sheer, unadulterated panic. "I can't taste it," she whispered, the admission lost under the noise of the printer spitting out the first tickets of the night. "It's all noise. The flavor is just noise." The internal dam was cracking. The Ferrari was redlining in neutral, the engine screaming, the heat building, and nowhere for the energy to go. I realized then that my role as the structure was failing. I couldn't build a shelter in the middle of a bombardment. The environment itself had become the enemy, and the launch hadn't even started. We were minutes away from the doors opening, and the general was paralyzed on the field, deafened by the static in her own head. The ticket machine began its rhythmic, stuttering shriek at 7:02 p.m. To a chef, that sound is Pavlovian. It triggers a spike in cortisol that sharpens the vision and numbs the fatigue. But tonight, for Valentina, it wasn't a signal to start. It was the sound of the walls closing in. We were 20 minutes into service, and the rhythm was already off. I could feel the dissonance in the air, a jagged syncopation that had nothing to do with the cooking, and everything to do with the woman standing at the pass. She was staring at a pan of reduction that was bubbling aggressively on the induction top. It was a simple task. Mount the butter, check the acidity, send it. But she wasn't moving. She was watching the bubbles rise and pop with a detached, horrifying fascination. The sauce broke. I saw the oil separate from the solids, a greasy slick forming on the surface, a cardinal sin in a Michelin kitchen. Valentina didn't flinch. She didn't reach for an ice cube to bring it back. She didn't curse. She didn't throw the pan into the sink. She just stood there, the ladle trembling in her hand, vibrating with that terrifying, silent static I had come to recognize in the privacy of my apartment. But we weren't in the apartment. We were in the blast zone. "Chef," I said, stepping up beside her. I kept my voice under the roar of the hood vents, pitching it to that specific grounding frequency. "The emulsion is gone." She turned to me slowly. The movement was viscous, like she was moving through water. When her eyes met mine, the air in my lungs froze. The Iron Chef was gone. The predator was gone. In her place was someone drowning in shallow water. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, and her face was slack with a terrifying executive dysfunction. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that the Ferrari engine had flooded. Too much fuel, too much pressure, and the spark plugs were wet. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, just a shallow, ragged gasp. She was trying to process the temperature of the stove, the shout of the expediter, the smell of the broken sauce, and the weight of the ladle all at once. And the system had critically failed. "I don't know where the next step is," she whispered. The confession was barely audible, but it hit me with the force of a physical blow. She had lost the map. The sequence of logic that connected A to B had been severed by the noise. I didn't ask her to try harder. I didn't tell her to snap out of it. I stepped in front of her, physically blocking her view of the kitchen, cutting off the stream of visual data. I became the wall. "Stop," I said, my voice hard, stripped of any softness. This wasn't a request. It was a command, from the structure to the chaos. I reached out and took the ladle from her hand. Her fingers were locked around it in a death grip, white-knuckled and cold despite the heat of the line. I had to pry them loose, finger by finger. "Step back." She didn't move. She was rooted to the floor by the sheer weight of her own panic. I grabbed her by the upper arm, a firm, stabilizing grip that bordered on bruising, and steered her away from the station. "Take the pass," I shouted to the junior Sioux, not looking back. "I'm off the floor for 5. I didn't wait for an acknowledgement. I marched Valentina through the swinging doors, past the dish pit where the steam hissed and the plates clattered, and into the narrow, windowless sanctuary of the dry storage office. I kicked the door shut behind us, severing the roar of the service instantly. The sudden silence was jarring, a pressure drop that made my ears pop. I didn't turn on the lights. The only illumination came from the glowing green LEDs of the server tower in the corner and the thin strip of light under the door. I guided her to the erratic, rolling office chair and pushed her down. She collapsed into it, her legs finally giving up the pretense of function. She was hyperventilating now, short, sharp gasps that sounded like tearing paper. "Breathe," I ordered. I went to the mini fridge we kept for staff drinks and grabbed a bottle of sparkling water. It was ice cold. I cracked the seal, the sharp hiss sounded like a gunshot in the small room, and pressed the cold glass against her neck, right over the pulse point. The sensory shock made her gasp, a long, shuddering intake of air that finally reached her lungs. "Feel that," I said, keeping the pressure steady. "Cold, wet, glass. Focus on the texture. Ignore the rest." She leaned into the cold bottle, her eyes fluttering shut. Her hands came up to grip my wrist, holding the cold source against her skin as if it were oxygen. I watched her throat work as she swallowed the panic, forcing it down. But as I looked at her, the sweat beading on her hairline, the gray pallor of her skin, the way her body was still vibrating with the aftershocks of the overload, I realized the office wasn't enough. The sensory reset wasn't working. The kitchen was still just on the other side of that door, waiting to eat her alive. She didn't need a 5-minute break. She needed a reboot. And she couldn't do it here. "You can't go back out there," I said, the realization settling heavy in my gut. It wasn't a question. "The engine is flooded, Valentina. If you try to restart it now, you'll blow the block." She shook her head, a weak, frantic denial. "The launch," she rasped. "The inspector." "I will handle the launch," I cut her off. My voice was the guardrail. "I will handle the inspector. You are a liability on that line right now." It was harsh, but it was the only language she understood. Efficiency. "You need to go." "Where?" she asked, and the word was small, terrified. "Everything is loud. The street is loud. My apartment it's too big." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They were warm from my body heat. The brass caught the faint light from the server tower. I pressed them into her hand, folding her trembling fingers over the jagged metal. "Go to the tower," I said. "Lock the door. Don't turn on the lights. Just wait." She looked at the keys, then up at me. The gratitude in her eyes was so raw, so naked. It felt like I had just kissed her. She nodded, standing up on shaky legs. She didn't argue. She fled. I watched her slip out the back exit, into the rainy alley, heading toward the one place where the static couldn't find her. Then I turned, took a deep breath, and walked back into the fire to cook her menu. The service ended, not with a bang, but with the whimpering slide of the last scouring pad against the stainless steel. We had survived. The menu had launched, the inspector had eaten the venison without a grimace, and the kitchen had not burned down. But as I walked home through the rain, the adrenaline that usually buoyed me was replaced by a heavy, leaden dread. I wasn't worried about the reviews. I was worried about the woman I had sent into the void. I unlocked my apartment door with the caution of a bomb disposal technician entering a blast site. The silence that greeted me was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty home. It was the pressurized, heavy silence of a deep-sea trench. The apartment had dissolved into a canyon of shadows. The amber lamps were off. The only illumination came from the city grid sprawling below, casting long, skeletal shapes across the floorboards. The storm outside had turned the skyline into a blurred watercolor of charcoal and gray. But inside, the air was still and thick. I found Valentina not on the sofa, but on the floor, wedged into the corner where the velvet armrest met the wall. She had built herself a fortress. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tight around her shins, her forehead resting on her knees. She hadn't changed out of her chef's whites, though she had shed the jacket. In her undershirt, stripped of the armor of the kitchen, she looked terrifyingly small. She wasn't shaking with the violent tremors of the crash anymore. Now she was humming with a terrifying, silent static. I knew this state. I had seen it in the way she sometimes gripped the edge of the boardroom table until her knuckles turned white. It was the paradox of her neurology. She was simultaneously overstimulated by the phantom noise of the crisis and understimulated by the lack of physical grounding. She looked untethered, as if gravity had simply ceased to apply to her, leaving her spinning in a void of unorganized data. Her brain was a kite in a hurricane. The string snapped, desperate for something heavy to pull it back to earth. I dropped my bag by the door. The sound was a dull thud, a real noise in a room of ghosts. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. "Valentina," I said. I kept my voice in that low, resonant register, the one that sat below the frequency of alarm bells. "I'm coming in." I didn't turn on the lights. To flood the room with lumens now would be an act of violence. I walked across the room, my socks sliding on the hardwood, until I reached her corner. The heat radiating from her was palpable before I even touched her. It was a fever of exhaustion, her metabolic engine still burning fuel even though the car was parked. I sat down next to her. I didn't sit near her. I sat with her. I pressed my side against hers, a deliberate, solid line of contact from shoulder to hip. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch immediately, blindly seeking the friction. "I can't feel the floor," she whispered. Her voice was a wreck, hoarse, stripped of cadence, raw. "I'm drifting. It's just white noise." "I know," I murmured. "I'm the anchor." She didn't need water. She didn't need kind words or reassurance about the sauce. She needed density. She needed weight. I shifted, moving from a passive presence to an active force. I reached out and wrapped my arm around her shoulders. It wasn't a tentative embrace. It was an architectural decision. I pulled her in, collapsing the space between us until she was flush against my chest. I used my other hand to cover her hands where they were clenched on her knees, pressing down hard. I became a human-weighted blanket. I applied steady, unyielding force, using the solidity of my own frame to counter the chaos in hers. I could feel the precise moment her nervous system registered the intervention. It started in her neck. The rigid tension, hard as stone, began to fracture. Then her breathing changed. The shallow, panic-induced rhythm faltered, held for a terrifying second, and then released into a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to empty her lungs completely. She slumped against me. The fight went out of her spine, and she melted into the structure I was providing. It was a heavy, total surrender. I rested my chin on the top of her head, smelling the rain that still clung to her hair, and that complex, metallic perfume that was so distinctly her. Underneath the scent of iris and ozone, there was something warmer, the smell of skin, exhaustion, and raw, unfiltered humanity. We sat there for a long time in the dark. The city lights below were distant constellations, irrelevant to the gravity well we had created on the hardwood floor. I was no longer just the sous chef. I was the operator of the machinery. I was the only one who knew the combination to the safe. And as the silence shifted from therapeutic to something thicker, something viscous and warm, I realized I didn't want to let go. The weight of her against me wasn't a burden. It was the only thing that felt real. The silence in the room shifted. The sharp, jagged edge of the panic attack dulled, replaced by a thick, viscous calm that settled over us like heavy silk. But as the fear receded, something else flooded into the vacuum to fill the space. The proximity changed. I became acutely aware of the heat radiating from her body. It was searing, soaking through the thin cotton of her undershirt and the wool of my trousers, branding me. The hand I was using to ground her shifted, my fingers sliding from the back of her hand to interlace with her fingers. It was an instinctive, dangerous adjustment. Her grip tightened instantly, holding on to me not just for stability, but with a sudden, fierce possession. She turned her head. Her cheek brushed against the fabric of my shirt, exploring the texture before she tilted her face up. I looked down. In the shadows, her eyes were vast, stripped of the chef's calculation. They were dark pools of want. The air between us thickened, charged with a sudden, undeniable voltage. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was a collision. "The static," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against my neck. "It's gone." "I know," I murmured. My gaze dropped to her mouth. Her lips were parted slightly, swollen from how she'd been biting them earlier in the chaos of the kitchen. The invitation was silent, absolute, and terrifying. "Why is it quiet here?" she asked. The question genuine, stripped of rhetoric. She shifted, turning her body fully toward me, her hand coming up to rest on my collarbone. "Even when you talk, why doesn't it hurt? Everyone else's noise, it's all interference, high-pitched, scrambled. But you..." She closed her eyes for a second, leaning imperceptibly into my touch. "Your voice cuts through the white noise. It's the only frequency that makes the static stop. It's the only thing I can hear clearly." The confession hung in the air, heavy and absolute. She wasn't talking about acoustics. She was talking about safety. She was telling me that in a world that constantly assaulted her senses, I was the signal. I was the clarity. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just a place to nap. I was the regulator. I can't go back to the noise, Cassandra, she said, the desperation sharpening her tone. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly before it landed on my waist. The touch was heavy, grounding. I've run the risk assessment. The cost of operating without you is too high. The static, it's inefficient. It consumes too much processing power just to exist. With you, the signal-to-noise ratio is perfect. She was negotiating a romance with the vocabulary of a business merger. And God help me, it was the most seductive thing I had ever heard. It was honest. It stripped away the messy, ambiguous language of dating and replaced it with raw, functional need. She didn't just want me. She required me. You're asking for a significant commitment, I whispered, holding my ground even as every instinct screamed at me to close the gap. Being the regulator, that's a 24-hour position. I know the terms, she countered, her gaze dropping to my mouth. Exclusive rights, indefinite tenure, access to the quiet room whenever the world gets too loud. And she paused, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw, feeling the heat of my skin underneath. Full integration of assets. And what do I get? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You get the Ferrari, she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The first smile I had seen in weeks. You get the engine. You get the chaos and the brilliance and the loyalty of someone who will burn the world down before she lets anyone touch you. You get to be the only person who knows how to drive. Deal, I breathed. She didn't hesitate. She closed the final inch, and the kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision of precision and desperate relief. It tasted like rain and exhaustion, like the release of a breath held for 3 weeks. There was a specific texture to it, unflinching and deliberate. For a woman who spent her life analyzing specific outcomes, this wasn't an experiment. It was a confirmation. I felt the tension leave her body in a physical wave. The rigid posture of the Iron Chef dissolved against me. Her hands moved from my waist to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer, deepening the contact until we were a single, fused entity in the center of the dark room. The static she talked about? I felt it shut off. The hum of anxiety that always vibrated under her skin went silent. In the circle of my arms, she was finally completely still. Morning usually brings the harsh light of regret, the awkward reshuffling of boundaries crossed in the dark. But when dawn broke over the city, slicing through the blinds of my apartment, the dynamic hadn't shattered. It had hardened. We walked into the restaurant not as two separate entities, the star and the shadow, but as a fused unit. The kitchen staff felt the shift before we even clocked in. The commis chefs moved out of our way like water parting for a ship, sensing the invisible tether connecting us. The air, usually thick with the tension of our rivalry, was clear. It was the terrifying clarity of a weapon that has finally been loaded correctly. The service that night was the autumn menu launch, the very event that had flooded her engine 24 hours prior. But tonight, the panic was gone. In its place was a flow state that looked like obsession to the uninitiated, but to me, watching from the pass, it looked like a symphony. Valentina was the conductor, moving with that lethal, kinetic grace, but I was the metronome. I kept the time. We developed a language that bypassed speech entirely. The kitchen is too loud for words, too slow for explanations. We spoke in proximity and percussion. When the VIP table ordered the tasting menu with a complex allergy modification, a curveball that would usually send Valentina into a spiral of overthinking, I saw her hand drift toward her hair, the telltale sign of the static rising. I didn't say a word. I simply shifted my weight, the leather of my shoes creaking softly against the mat, and tapped my tasting spoon once against the stainless steel counter. A sharp, singular click. Her hand dropped instantly. She didn't look at me, but I saw the corner of her mouth tighten. She had received the data. Stay present. I have the logistics, you handle the art. It was a telepathic waltz. When I pushed a glass of water toward her, it was a signal to pause, to let the silence stretch before calling the next check. When I leaned forward, invading her personal space by an inch, it was the green light to push the brigade harder. We were a two-headed hydra, moving with a synchronized intelligence that was terrifying to behold. The inspectors ate the venison. They ate the truffle. They ate the silence we had plated between the courses. The success of the launch wasn't a battle won. It was a duet, performed perfectly. The friction that had defined our careers, the jealousy, the competition, the noise, had been converted into pure propulsive energy. She was the Ferrari engine, finally running on the open road, and I was the hands on the wheel, steering us away from the wall. By the time the last ticket was spiked, the kitchen was quiet. But it wasn't the heavy silence of exhaustion. It was the ringing, electric silence of a bomb that had gone off exactly as planned. We stood side by side at the pass, shoulders brushing, smelling of smoke and victory. The apartment was no longer just a home, and the kitchen was no longer a war zone. Both had become shared territories of our merged nervous systems. We didn't go to separate homes that night. The logic of the body double had evolved into an absolute necessity. As we walked back to my apartment, the city rain washing away the kitchen scent, I realized that the boundaries had been permanently redrawn. She needed the silence I provided to exist, and I needed the chaos she generated to feel alive. We were no longer operating on separate frequencies. We were a closed loop, a perfect circuit of signal and noise. The door is locked now. The world is shut out, and the static is finally gone. We found the only frequency that works. She provides the brilliance, and I provide the gravity so she can fly without crashing. It's a dangerous, perfect balance. If you understand the desperate need for a human anchor in a chaotic world, subscribe for more stories. The storm is over, but we are just getting started.